the update on global gender issues, highlighting a strategy for progress, which is DC for Cedaw. The time is now. And Karen Mulhauser, a longtime leader of many organizations. She's the past chair of the United Nations Associations of the United States and the past president of the United Nations Association for the National Capital Area, will provide a brief history and update on the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Karen, do you want to take it away?
Okay, thank you so much, Sue, and it's good to see you all here today. Yes, I have been involved in gender equity issues for a long time, starting from when I realized that I wasn't going to be a scientist doing research with rats, that I'd rather work with people. So I actually ran the National Abortion Rights Action League in the 70s, and I have been working on gender equity issues ever since it became clear to me that women are not going to be truly equal until they can decide when or if to have children. And so that's sort of guided everything that I've done in the decades since. CEDAW exemplifies that, and my work through the United Nations Association has allowed me to focus on gender equity issues through CEDAW. And it's easier to say CEDAW, but if you don't know what that stands for, people say CEDAW, but it's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And it passed the United Nations General Assembly in 1979. And for those of you who remember that far back, in 1980, President Carter signed it. And then the idea with UN resolutions and treaties is that every country, every member state of the UN has an opportunity to ratify it. The United States has never ratified CEDAW. And it is one of the 6 remaining countries in the whole world that has not ratified CEDAW. And obviously, some of the countries that have ratified aren't practicing the principles of CEDAW. Otherwise, we wouldn't have trafficking, and we wouldn't have sexual assaults, and we wouldn't have the fact that girls don't go to school, and so forth and so on. But at least they've gone on record by ratifying it. So back in 1998, San Francisco decided that it would have a local San Francisco ratification of the principles of CEDAW. And then since then, let me check my notes so I get this right. There is a website that you can all go to, and I'll put the link in the chat box later, but or somebody else can do it. There's a group called Cities for CEDAW that collects information on CEDAW, on the treaty, and on the different cities and counties in the United States that have passed ordinances. There are 9 cities that have passed ordinances or bills, binding legislation for CEDAW, and there are 31 cities or towns that have passed resolutions, which are non-binding, but at least they go on record saying we ought to recognize gender equity. And so those states, have set the ground rules, and maybe will be able to pass ordinances that are binding at a later time. And there are 31 communities, including Washington, DC, that are considering legislation. And just the history of doing this in Washington, DC, back when I was in the leadership of the chapter in 2015, there was UNA National Capital Area had an important meeting in January, and this was where we, among other things, were announcing that we were going to work to have Washington, DC be a city for CEDAW. And the United Nations Association National Capital Area actually includes all of Maryland and the Northern Virginia suburbs. And so once we had done it in DC, we wanted to go to other jurisdictions. And Montgomery County, we heard from Montgomery County a little while ago, could be maybe the next community. And I'd be happy to work with you on that. But what this would mean is that the city council, so the legislative branch and the mayor, the executive branch, would agree that this makes sense and would support such legislation. A bill was introduced in March of 2015 by Council Member David Grosso, but it didn't have a hearing and there was never a vote. So it died in that legislative session. And when I went around to every single council member to see if somebody else would introduce it in 2017, I couldn't find anyone who would do that. But what I did find was Council Member Charles Allen, who said that he would write to the city administrator and ask that the performance reports of each of the DC government agencies should include gender data. We had done some research and found that of the 80+ agencies, none of them had gender data. So we didn't know how many women worked there, how many men worked there, if women were promoted in the same way that men were, if they were making the same salaries. And so we thought that by having this kind of data would give us a start on doing a gender audit in our city, in our nation's capital. And the city administrator said that, yes, we could do that, but it's never happened. So we have decided at the UN Association National Capital Area that we're going to try again. And what we did last time, we're going to take some of the same principles. We identified a couple of dozen, maybe more, supporting organizations that would work with us, groups that had members and residents in DC who could then write to each of their council members and asking them to support this legislation. Actually, when it was introduced, almost every council member co-sponsored it. So maybe we just got too comfortable. We thought, no big deal. They are all sponsoring it, it'll pass. But we didn't have a hearing and we didn't have a vote. So we had some public forums that all of the supporting organizations told their members about, as well as UNA, and forums on pay equity and on health issues, including abortion rights and so forth. And so we're deciding that a lot has changed in the time since we first introduced this. And so maybe the time is right now. There's even talk, although it's going to be challenging, to see if we can get ERA become the Equal Rights Amendment to become the law of the land, because enough states have ratified that constitutional amendment, but there's challenges to that. So, but also so many other things have happened, like the Me Too movement, and just sort of, and a woman vice president, and enough other things have changed to acknowledge the reality that it's time to acknowledge gender equity. So I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Shayna, who's the managing director for advocacy at UNA National Capital Area, and sort of leading the charge at this point to, along with some other leaders in UNA, to have the legislation reintroduced and to have it perhaps later this year passed. So it does mean, though, working with both the legislative branch and the executive branch of DC government. So I'm happy to take questions later on after Shayna has made her remarks. So thank you, Sue, for letting me do this, and Connie, because you will recall that I spoke with this group at least a couple of times about Cedaw in the past. And so there's different, I did it in person before, and there are different faces on the screen now. So it's maybe news to some people.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd also like to have Jill Christensen say hi. And Jill, tell us your office in the UN Association.
Hi there. I'm just so glad to join up with the Clearinghouse and that the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area is able to sponsor this work on Cedaw in Washington, D.C., but also then to share it all with you because we know that you are change makers and shakers. So thank you. My role within what we call UNANCA, the UN Association of DC, Maryland, and Virginia, is as chair-elect, and come June, I'll be chair, but have known many of you through my 20 plus years at the National Education Association, leading international relations work, but also then always the deep filter throughout all the work, no matter whether I was working in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, or in Europe, was in fact gender equity throughout, not only for women educators, but ensuring that education itself is just. So I'm glad to have you here, and you will hear now from Shayna Vayser, who is in fact our wonderful staff member that has led our advocacy.
But before Shayna starts, I want to take credit for bringing Jill to the UNANCA. So it was, we were doing some work together on international issues, and I started talking about UNA, and then she joined, and now she's chair-elect. So that's one of the things I'm very proud of.
Thank you, Karen. And definitely you'll see me at future meetings as well. All right, I pass it off.
All right, I'm happy to take it away from here if Sue, that works for you.
Sure.
Thank you, Karen, for the context. I'm so thrilled to be here, especially with Karen and Jill. It's such a pleasure. I've actually brought slides with me, so I hope you don't mind looking at them. I tend to talk a little fast when I am as caffeinated as I currently am, calling in from the West Coast. So I figured it might be helpful to get some visual cues as we move through this content. I wanted to share a little bit more about what UNANCA actually is and what our presence is, both locally and nationally, for those who aren't familiar. So the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area essentially represents some 2,000 members, volunteers, supporters across Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And we're just a subset of the National United Nations Association, which I think at this point has close to 20,000 members. Our mandate is to build public knowledge, to strengthen UN-US relations, but also to aid the UN in achieving its goals. We often like to say we're bridging those global goals with local action. The key goal in this context is within their the UN Sustainable Development Goal Framework, which is their goals to achieve by 2030. Goal 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. One of the frameworks that we can do that through is Cedaw. I think Karen's given a really strong context as to what Cedaw is. What I want to specifically highlight, Cedaw, the UN treaty, defines discrimination, what constitutes discrimination on the basis of gender, but also sets an agenda for national action. It's because it's a universal treaty, it's very broad. There's not a lot of detail, which is great because then it can be adapted to a municipal level. Now, why a little more context as to why Cities for Cedaw is around. For a number of reasons, Cedaw was never ratified, unfortunately. The most recent dialogue there's been on the subject was back in 2010 when then President Barack Obama entered office. He said he was interested in potentially pursuing ratification in the Senate. In November of 2010, the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Human Rights held a hearing, and that was really it. It kind of died on the floor there. And we haven't really seen a resurgence for, unfortunately, a number of reasons. However, that has then given way to this national grassroots effort, Cities for Cedaw. I dropped a link in the chat, so I encourage you to take a look at it. Like Karen mentioned, 40 cities have passed either a resolution or an ordinance. And the idea is to use the flexibility of the UN Cedaw Treaty and implement those principles on a local level. Karen mentioned that San Francisco was the first city to adopt a local ordinance reflecting the principles of Cedaw back in 1998. San Francisco identified 3 key components that are part of successful implementation. Two, I think, are pretty straightforward: an oversight body and funding. Makes sense from a governing standpoint. But the third is gender analysis data, which is really critical because when we consider vulnerability in our communities, when we consider unequal access to resources, our data often looks along the lines of race and disability and immigration status and sexual orientation, but often forgets that link to gender and those intersections between points of identity. When we introduce gender analysis data in the workforce, in the services that municipalities offer, in the city budget, it not only is a point of transparency within local government, but it forces legislators to think about how resources are actually being distributed. Is it in an equitable and an inclusive way? And what's really critical about San Francisco is how that then took shape in real terms. Under their ordinance, San Francisco eliminated domestic homicides for a record 44 months between the years of 2010 and 2013. Which is really incredible for a number of reasons, because it starts with sort of workplace parity. It starts with gender analysis data. And from that foundation, San Francisco was able to build out their commission on the status of women to launch a number of projects that were focused on violence against women, that were very reflexive, very collaborative with community members, and really institutionalized something pretty remarkable in terms of advancing the rights of women and girls within their community. What's key about Cedaw is it's not just economic stability, it's not just physical safety, it's also educational access, it's the social arenas. And again, it's the challenge there is it's so universal because it's a global treaty that it lacks real definition, but that also then gives you the potential to use the foundation of gender analysis data to build out programs that meet the needs of the specific city. Karen introduced UNANCA's previous efforts in 2015. Councilman David Grosso introduced a local implementation of Cedaw. The bill called for two things: conduct gender analysis data, facilitated by the Office of Human Rights by amending the Office of Human Rights Establishment Act, and essentially position the OHR as the responsible party for developing a plan, a citywide action plan, ensuring equality for women and girls, again, in the economic, educational, political, social, and cultural arenas that are pursuant to Cedaw. Despite those co-sponsorships from a majority of council members, a hearing was never scheduled, it was never brought to a hearing, it was never brought to a vote, which brings us to today. I think Karen did a really great job of setting sort of the national landscape and what differs now. I don't think I'm alone in thinking it feels like in 2021, we live in a much different world than in 2015. So many things have changed. Specifically, a majority of the DC Council members are women. UNANCA is working to expand its coalition efforts. We're engaging new partners like the National Women's Political Caucus, Women Enabled International, the ICRW, that should say the YWCA, in the hopes that we'll be able to put more pressure, not only to have legislation introduced, but to take it to the next step, to actually require DC Council legislators to go on record and vote. In addition, COVID has exposed the unique vulnerability of women and girls, not only in terms of, I'm sure the statistics that with this group I'm talking to, you're all far too familiar with: increase in domestic violence, unemployment, homelessness for both women and children, such that when we're thinking about economic recovery, which is something we've heard quite often, the priority is economic recovery for DC, we have to ensure that those recovery frameworks are specifically taking women and girls into consideration. And one way to do that is through the integration of gender analysis data. What we're asking for from DC Council is essentially the reintroduction of this 2015 legislation on the local implementation, calling for the same things: gender analysis data facilitated by OHR, and positioning OHR as the primary body that's responsible for a citywide action plan. Our understanding is that the fiscal impact will depend on whether or not OHR would need to hire someone new, and how much I don't want to sit here and say that it's a minimal or negligible fiscal impact because of the fact that OHR, the performance reports, they're already collecting some demographic data, just not gender. And so theoretically, you could just add this on and it wouldn't be, to me, it feels like a bare minimum to introduce. But we haven't heard back from the city administrator's office, so we don't have a concrete fiscal note yet. The way that we see this is not only as a measure for transparency and accountability within the DC government, but as something that's really essential when thinking about our city's post-COVID economic recovery. And that, like I said, the introduction of gender analysis data feels like a first step, a stepping stone towards what we can then expand that to. We could use it as a foundation under this umbrella of Cedaw, the principles of Cedaw, to institute new policies to grow. I know, Karen, we've talked about something like a GEAR Act or something that's even more comprehensive, but starting with understanding the landscape that we're working within through the data that the DC government would then be collecting. So part of the reason why we're talking to you today is because we need your help in order to do this. We're currently requesting signatures for a sign-on letter that we've written to send to the DC Council, urging them to pass local implementation of DC for Cedaw for the reasons that we've essentially outlined to you today. We're seeking individual and organizational signatures. This is something that from a logistical standpoint, we can share with you so that you can actually take the time to consider and determine if it's something that you want to sign on. But in summary, the viewpoint is pretty straightforward. The reason that we've had such a challenge in DC compared to 31 other cities is that we're not seeking a resolution, we're seeking an ordinance. We don't think it's enough for DC Council to just say that they support gender equality and that's too easy. We want legislation, we want them to go on the record and vote against this if it's something that they don't believe in, but we want to push it to a vote. And we want to do that by mobilizing national organizations and international supporters, sure, but really DC residents, institutions that have a strong foothold in DC to represent that this is a very communal, community-driven effort. So with that, happy to answer questions, and also with Karen and Jill here, we're happy to chat about this a bit more. But thank you so much for your time and for hearing us out today.
Thank you both. I think we have time for some questions right now, and then we'll go on and hear from Megan about broader global gender equity issues. Who has the first question about Cedaw? Well, I'll start with one then. Or Connie, you want to start?
I did. I was horrified to hear that it never got more than a titular introduction at the council meeting. And I wondered, did it have budgetary implications? Would that be why they?
Yes, that's part of it, Connie. And I actually serve on the DC Human Rights Commission, and at the end of each of our commission members, so over the last several years, I would talk to them about, we need to have this legislation passed. And yes, it is going to have an impact on the Office of Human Rights. And so, but a lot of that impact is sort of consistent with what they're already doing, the Office of Human Rights, in terms, but it probably would mean another staff person or some, to monitor how the different agencies are doing this. There are 84, 85 different DC agencies, and it's the city administrator's office, and the city administrator reports to the mayor that collects the reports. It doesn't cost them anything to add another column for gender data. So the initial implementation, if this bill gets a hearing later this year and is brought to a vote, there's not going to be immediate cost implications, but it probably would be some implementing costs in next year's budget. in terms of the Office of Human Rights. The training, because the Office of Human Rights would have to do training for some of the different agencies on, you know, what implementing CEDAW means. But the Office of Human Rights does training all the time, and I actually am starting a committee of the commission to do outreach. And you better believe it, that some of the outreach I want to do is on CEDAW legislation. So, and this is something that all of us can do. And when Shayna mentioned that we want to recruit some signatures on this letter, they can be individual signatures or organization signatures. Obviously, if we can sign up some organizations, then they can reach out to their hundreds or thousands of members in DC. And then those members can reach out, and we'll provide tools and sample language. They can reach out to their council members and to the mayor and say, do this. There is, in the mayor's office, there's an Office of Women Policy and Initiatives. And so we've been talking with them, as well as talking with some of the council members about doing this finally.
I'll speak up for a moment if that's okay. Just to remind you that in the chat, Emma was able to place both the one-pager background and the petition. So be sure to take a moment to copy those addresses while we are in discussion here, because they are very important. And for sure, we will channel these slides to Connie so that she can distribute them to the entire clearinghouse.
Well, and the session has been recorded, so they could be, received that way as well. I'd also like to mention that at the very top of the chat, Shayna has entered the link to Cities for CEDAW. So you can, there's a toolkit there. There's lots of information on that website that you can share with your organizations. And as we do, of course, want to have DC organizations involved with this, but if there are national organizations that have DC members, we'd love to have them sign on and get the word out to their DC members. And then when we get this done, we'll go to Montgomery County.
I notice Kathy Sheeran is on from the League of Women Voters. Kathy, have you all done anything in DC on this yet?
We haven't. We do have a relationship with the UN in that we have a core of women who are UN observers in New York, and they do follow all of this and on year-round observers, and then a separate set of, I think it's 5 or 6 of us who were observers at the recent consultation on women. What is it? We're 66, I think, was the number this year. So there is a connection, but in terms of the DC League, we just at the moment don't have bandwidth to tackle this, although clearly it's an issue that we connect with and we react to, but I don't know if I could actually make it happen, given how statehood is bubbling excitingly.
But Kathy, you could sign on, and that doesn't take a lot of time or any money.
No, but I have to get through the board and all of that to do it. But yes, you're right, Karen. Absolutely. So I was doing screenshots all along here and getting all this. Yeah, and we have a relationship with the human rights folks, the DC human rights folks, because I work with them closely with Charles Thornton on returning citizens, but we haven't connected in other areas, much to my dismay, because I've sent innumerable emails and never gotten a response. So maybe Karen, I could push you to see if the director would respond to me. That might
Yeah,
help.
I love an excuse to get together with you, Kathy.
I should have put my necklace on, but I see yours. Anyway, back to business. Otherwise, we'll just keep chatting away.
Lisa Sales, noticed you had a good comment in the chat. Do you want to say it out loud? Unmute.
Sure. Sorry for the delay. I'm struggling here. I was glad so you caught me, so I'll come on camera. Hi, everyone. So last session I wrote, I was just bringing it up, I think it's HR 277, a resolution in the General Assembly. It's about 190 lines on behalf of Hala Ayala, Delegate Hala Ayala, now running for Lieutenant Governor, on behalf of Cedaw. I mean, nobody celebrates the 40th anniversary, really, but I used the 40th anniversary year of Cedaw to put it front and center in the House of Delegates, and to underscore all the inequities I could possibly think of that women face. But the kicker comes at the end, where I asked them to do what we've been asking Cedaw to do, which was to do in a follow-up GA, right, to establish a task force to assess gender equity in all state agencies, boards, authorities, and commissions. So happy to share that with Connie to be passed around if you like. And then I did a follow-up radio interview to highlight what was in the resolution. And I'm happy to share that recording as well. So however I can help support this effort, I am working with our Virginia League of Women Voters in the Fairfax area to also bring this to the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors so we can do it on a local level as well.
That's very exciting, Lisa. And there is one other state, big surprise, it's the left coast. California is the only state that has ratified or it's
My birth state.
Yes. Well, that explains it then.
No, but and then I will add one thing which I thought was interesting to note. We've been working, with the Gender Policy Council, and I was on the Biden transition, Biden domestic policy team, writing memos to establish the White House Gender Policy Council. And one of their report updates, I guess, that was passed around came out and it underscored, some of the successes of the president. Obviously, it underscored, I guess they're coining violence against women as safety now. Sounds like the new buzzword, and a bunch of other things. And the two things that weren't on there was ERA and Cedaw. So many think that we don't have ERA or we don't have Cedaw because we don't have ERA. So just another wrinkle, and all the work, underscoring all the work we have to do, still to do. Thanks.
Any other comments?
And again, a DC initiative that is successful with Cedaw could in fact create more buzz and more action as far as the ratification of the Cedaw Treaty itself. Again, years ago, I was very, very involved in the coalition and worked very hard. We had over 200 national organizations that signed on, but also individuals, statewide organizations, and beyond. Knowing that you all have so many links, what we're looking for is signature to begin with. We would love boots on the ground, but at the same time, signature would be just wonderful in order to help further this so that we can actually see it through to a vote. And Shayna, can you talk about the timeline again on that?
Sure thing. We're doing our big push for signatures this week. We want to be able to submit the note in June because, for some context, we had heard from one council member, I believe it's Robert White, that he was interested but wouldn't be able to take a look at it in June, which to me feels like code for stop bothering me. I'm not confident that anything will be introduced in June. We don't really have any security there. So our hope is to be able to submit the letter, at least with our first round of signatures, within the next week or so, or 2 weeks. I will note that the sign-on form, which Emma has shared, and that hopefully I'll be able to circulate along with the slides for you, it does give you the option to just sign and then say, don't contact me again, or you can opt in if you want to receive updates, participate in some meetings with council members, and take on a more active role in the actual advocacy. So it's very much an opting in as opposed to an opting out, which I know is everyone's sort of at their bandwidth these days, which will hopefully help with capacity on your end.
And I have a sort of a general question for anyone who wants to answer it. I was wondering, the gender analysis component is so important for budgets and for all kinds of federal as well as local and state data collections. And it's also being used a lot in international data collections. Do you have some templates that you suggest that are being used for gender analysis at all levels, at the federal level? And also, is anything being done to encourage the OMB and other federal legislation to collect gender analysis data?
So I don't know at the federal level with regard to OMB, but I believe on the Cities for Cedaw website, which is the link is at the very top of the chat, that there is a toolkit for how to do a gender analysis. And that is the first thing that we want to have happen. It is necessary to be the first thing to happen in order to get Cedaw implemented, is to know just where the injustices and the inequities are now so we can go about correcting them. But it's the gender audit is an early important first step. Yeah.
And I'll add to that. Oh, sorry, Karen.
Go ahead.
I'll add to that in that this domestic policy team that I was on, we recommended an equity assessment. And so what is happening, and from where I sit in my professional day life as a federal consultant, I'm seeing it happen. And so we recommended this race and gender equity assessment. And so I think what's filtering out to all the agencies, I'm seeing at Defense for sure, is all the agencies moving out to do a gender and race equity assessment. So in all pockets, I don't know what the quality of it will be. It's a mad dash and scramble to answer this. You said OMB, and it's an OMB form with a lot of questions on it, So I'll just share that.
Great. Yeah, that's it. Jill?
Sorry, I was just going to pose to Shayna. There was a question that showed up in the chat that we've not yet answered, and maybe you can answer it, Shayna. And that is, now I'm looking at it, from Crystal Peters. If Cedaw depends on the ERA, are we putting pressure on Merrick Garland? First off, does it depend on the ERA? And then if you could talk further, thanks.
At the local level, no, and I can throw this to Karen, but at the local level, we're focused on, I'm trying to think of the best word to describe it instead of, we're almost like shaping Cedaw to fit the DC context. We're implementing those principles. And I dropped a link to the toolkit in the chat as well, which I think does a really great job of talking about all of the supporting resolutions and pieces of legislation that fall under the umbrella of Cedaw, Violence Against Women Act, and the ERA, but are not necessarily dependent on their passage. It's just citing that they'll all work in tandem with one another if we're to reach this true goal of universal equity, true equity, and the like. And it also, Sue, to your previous question, there's a specific example of what a gender analysis looks like and how to implement it. So in short, no, we are not putting pressure on Merrick Garland, and our efforts are not dependent on the passage of the ERA. I believe that would just be at the federal level if we were to pursue ratification.
Excellent discussion. Is anything more on this discussion before we move on to Megan? Okay, hearing nothing more. I want to go to our Clearinghouse on Women's Issues, wonderful Vice President on Global Affairs, Megan Corrado. who's also our CWI secretary and very talented member of our board. So Megan, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks so much to all the speakers before me. That was really interesting and good to hear. And I'll kind of reflect a little bit of how domestic and international policy intersects throughout my presentation. But just want to say hello to everybody. A special hello to Kim Otis, my former boss. Good to see her on here, and good to have you all together this afternoon. So quickly, I'd just like to give you an overview of what has been going on for the last few months. We just passed the 100-day mark, which has a bit of an outsized influence, I think, but it's a good time to pause and reflect on what's gone on over the past few months with the Biden administration in terms of gender equality. I think first and foremost, it's good to note that there was a lot of progress on intersectionality, and general policies that are good for all humanity. On the first day, we joined the Paris Agreement. The next day, we joined the WHO. On the 25th of January, the administration reversed a harmful executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. So these small actions not just benefit women and girls, but also all of us. So that was positive momentum right at the gate. We were pleased to see. And even from the campaign in the early days of the administration, they did make a commitment to ensuring that cabinet nominations reflected gender parity, diversity, and inclusive representation across the administration. And you've seen that quite well reflected in the diversity of the administration, particularly in the State Department and USAID. We do have a woman administrator at USAID, so good to see that. We are still waiting to see an ambassador for the Office of Global Women's Issues in State Department who kind of coordinates all of gender issues in our foreign policy. So hoping that comes out soon, but worth noting that they are making progress. So more specifically in terms of what's been going on with gender equity, there was a lot to untangle in the early days. As of January 28th, the administration repealed the expanded Mexico City policy, also known as the Global Gag Rule, and resumed funding to the UN Population Fund. That was a really important milestone for the global gender community, something we've been advocating for a long time. We were actually a little disappointed because most administrations do that on the first day. We had to wait a week, but it came through anyway. And positively, they did direct the agencies to appoint specific focal points to coordinate the implementation of action plans regarding women's health and the repeal of the Global Gag Rule. A few weeks later, in terms of our security forces, the administration appointed an independent review commission to address the sexual assault in the military, another positive issue that we saw really come to bear in the last administration. And then, of course, on International Women's Day, a big day, and I think Lisa alluded to it earlier, but this was the day the executive order was issued that created the White House Gender Policy Council. It also mandates a national gender strategy, includes one on foreign policy, on diplomacy, development, trade, and defense. You see a lot of intersection with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in that executive order as well, which we're pleased to see. So back to the Policy Council, they appointed 2 co-chairs and an executive director tasked with development and oversight of the strategy. There's both a domestic and foreign policy component, which we're pleased to see. So the strategy is supposed to be completed early fall, within 200 days after March 8th, and then it requires an annual report next March 8th. Also required the designation of agency representatives to the council within 30 days and semi-annual agency reporting requirements. So good to see transparency mechanisms put into place right away. On the same day, the administration nominated 2 women generals to elite 4-star commands, positive developments there. And then in the following weeks, you saw some additional milestones. On the 11th of March, the administration hosted a virtual consultation on U.S. priorities for the Commission on the Status of Women, with many civil society representatives, quite diverse group that were able to sort of articulate our needs, issues, and concerns to the delegation going forward. On the 15th that month, the administration sent a high-level diverse delegation to CSW that for the first time included representation from the White House, including the Vice President. She was also joined there with the Ambassador to the UN, Linda Greenfield, which was fabulous and both reflected not only the White House commitment to women's issues on the global field, but also the diversity of the administration. So really pleased to see that sort of intersectional, diverse representation at such a high level. And one of my favorite quotes from the vice president was, quote, "The status of women is the status of democracy." So really articulating our commitment to, you can't have one without the other. So appreciated that. And it was the first time in history that the White House has been represented at CSW, period. So really appreciate it. It was something the civil society community had pushed for quite vociferously in the weeks leading up to it, and wasn't really announced till last minute, but we were pleased to see it happen anyway. So good to see. And then in the ensuing weeks, they had a number of different sort of advances. You had promises made by the U.S. trade representatives to tackle a long list of challenges, including racial and gender inequities in the economic issues. You had an appointment of a special assistant to the president for global gender policy. And then on the 30th of March, we saw the announcement of reinstating the reporting requirements for the State Department's annual human rights reports on women, reproductive rights, and access to healthcare. These were removed in the previous administration. So having that transparency and accountability for our, around the world was something we were very worried about in the Mass administration, and pleased to see that it was one of the first things Secretary Blinken put forward. In terms of funding, we can't make progress if we don't have the funding to do it, right? So at this point, only the skinny budget has been released. We are expecting the president's full request on this Friday, which is also my birthday. I always wanted a full budget for my birthday, so appreciate that. So what we said, for those that don't know, the skinny budget is basically an outline of the financial budgetary priorities for the administration. It did include $1 billion in investment in gender-based violence prevention and response domestically, and robust funding for diplomacy, development, economic statecraft generally. But we did not see any details about resources to implement the work of the White House gender policy in particular, or the broader gender recommendations and laws. We have the Women, Peace, and Security Act. We have these other foreign-facing gender-relevant laws and strategies, the GBV strategy, USA gender policy. So we didn't see a lot of detail, but again, it's an outline. So, it's a little early to evaluate it until we see the actual full budget. However, it did fail to mention gender equality or women's rights as foreign policy priorities. Secretary Blinken has made some statements on foreign policy priorities, and those issues have been omitted as well. So hoping and appealing through various letters and communiques with the State Department to try and get clarity on that, to make sure that women's issues are integrated across all foreign policy. And I guess in terms of, so we've seen some progress, we've seen a little early to evaluate on the financial issues, but of course, 100 days, you can only do so much. So there have been some sort of either, I wouldn't necessarily say failures, but yet to-do lists remaining for the administration in the coming days. So related to our previous presentation, Biden has not tasked the co-chairs of the White House gender policy with working with legislative counterparts to advance ratification of Cedaw. So that's something we'd really like to see, both Cedaw and other gender relevant international laws and treaties as well. The administration has yet to develop a US feminist foreign policy, something we've been pushing for some time now. But really, and that's a heavy lift, but we really like to see the administration at least outline how gender will be integrated throughout foreign policy more broadly, including climate and environmental policy, and what actions will be undertaken to ensure structures are transformed to advance intersectional gender equality. As I mentioned earlier, they've yet to appoint an ambassador to GWI, Global Women's Issues Office at State Department, who really does coordinate a lot of gender work in our foreign policy. So that needs to be a priority for the administration. We've also yet to see the appointment of full-time foreign policy personnel at the Gender Policy Council, full-time senior director at the National Security Council, State Department, and USAID. So these are pretty important posts for coordinating purposes. So really pushing the administration to move that forward as soon as possible. And one thing we'd really like to see is the advancement of a civil society advisory council for the White House Gender Policy Council to make sure that there is ongoing communication in this vehicle. There are lots of talks going on right now about sort of an initial consultation and what that will look like, and we're hoping to roll that out in the coming weeks as we move forward. In terms of the more substantive law and policy implementation challenges they've faced. So I would say the key one is with the Women, Peace, and Security Act. And for those not familiar, the WPS Act was passed in 2017. It mandated a strategy that came out in 2019, and then implementation plans for the Departments of State, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and USAID. So those came out last June and requires the agencies to work together and to put together these plans that advance women's participation in all forms of peace processes, political processes, post-conflict recovery and crisis. And we knew that Afghanistan was going to be the test case for the WPS implementation. There's been a peace process ongoing for the last 2 years. So with the announcement of the US military reduction, I think there was a lot of concern about what this means for Afghan women and girls. They've made tremendous strides and advances over the last 20 years. And we've heard a little bit about some money being appropriated, $300 million that was announced in tandem with the military withdrawal announcement, but it's unclear as to what the US government is doing to, one, preserve the rights and gains that they've made, two, ensure their participation in any type of peace process and talks moving forward, and three, to continue to financially fund and support women-led and women organizations to benefit women and girls moving forward. Obviously there's going to be a lot of security challenges with the potential rise of the Taliban and reversion to the situation pre 9/11, in which women were basically locked in their homes and not allowed to go to school or work or move around. So some pretty big concerns as to that. There's a lot of ongoing advocacy there to make sure that women's issues remain at the forefront. And we have seen significant oversight from Republicans and Democrats alike in Congress. There's been a number of briefings and hearings over the last few weeks, and this issue has been pretty much asked by every single senator and representative. So we have appreciated the congressional leadership on that. So something we do need to keep an eye on in terms of the administration moving forward. Another key law and policy issue is the implementation of the Global Fragility Act. This was passed in December 2019 and really tries to reconfigure US foreign policy to take a prevention-oriented approach rather than a response to violent conflict, terrorism. So really to be looking for, keeping an eye on fragile countries at risk for violence and conflict, and to be doing development, diplomatic, and other non-militarized interventions there to avoid the use of force and prevent backsliding of rights. That came out again, as I said, December 2019. A strategy came out December 2020. It's a little bit bare bones, and they're also supposed to be coming out with sort of 5 pilot countries or regions to sort of move this framework forward. We have yet to see deadlines for the revision of the strategy and plans. We'd also like to see the ways in which gender is going to be integrated into these plans, and a little bit more explanation as to how the GFA strategy and the WPS strategy and other government-wide strategies are in communication with each other. So how do these relate to the national security strategy as well? So these are some things that we're pushing the administration to elucidate in the coming weeks and months. And then lastly, I would say the Eli Wiesel Genocide and Prevention Act. This is really intended to prevent, keep an eye for US to be focused on prevention of mass atrocities around the globe. There is a lot of concern that this relates to Afghanistan as well. You are seeing a targeting of women and girls, specifically minorities, the Hazara community. There was that horrible bombing about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, of a Hazara girls' school. 85 people died, mostly young girls. So keeping an eye on situations like that, but we've yet to hear publicly, at least, plans that the administration has. What's their integrated approach towards monitoring atrocities issues, and the ways in which that they are focusing on countries such as Afghanistan, Burma, Ethiopia, sort of no shortage of context to watch at this moment. So hoping to see more information about the ways in which they're including a gender analysis in that issue. So what can we do? A couple of things. In terms of the technical side, we'd like to see a high-level delegation to the June Generation Equality Forum to announce a commitment to feminist foreign policy. We'd like to join our partners in the world that are doing this. There's some good opportunities there where the Canadians, Mexicans, Swedens, some of the other countries leading on the feminist foreign policy will be there, and it would be a good opportunity to articulate our commitment. We'd also like to see a commitment to structural change across all foreign policy levers, including personnel systems, procurement policies, program planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. So we can't have a better foreign policy more broadly if we're not doing the nitty-gritty work within the agencies as well. We're looking forward to the development of the government-wide strategy on advancing gender equality, which will be coming out in the fall for the executive order, hoping that it contains lots of broad and substantive civil society consultation, looking for development agency-specific costed action plans to develop the gender strategy, including that contains information about policy, staffing, training, funding, legislative affairs, and communications needs. We're also hoping to see both the administration and Congress provide more resources to implement the work of the White House Gender Policy Council, both on the domestic and foreign policy sides. Also would like to see that 100% of all U.S. international programs consider and incorporate intersectional gender analysis in program design, implementation, and evaluation. We've been requesting that 20% of U.S. foreign assistance funding be dedicated to promoting gender equality as a primary goal, not just as a tick the box in more broader international programs. And we're also asking for increased investment in women's rights organizations and feminist movements around the world so that we're getting empowering women on the grassroots to do bottom-up change. And then in terms of some of the laws I mentioned earlier with the WPS Act, we'd like to see it revised, both the strategy and the plans. We'd like to see it first, at least deadlines for when the administration plans to do that to really make sure they're quite robust. Some of the agencies or plans are better than the others. We'd really like to get them all up a couple levels. And then, of course, we'd like to see the administration commit to supporting Afghan women's participation in the peace process, as well as to protect their gains upon withdrawal and provide long-term development assistance to both in terms of both peace building as well as humanitarian issues as well. In terms of the GFA, we'd like to see women's issues and gender analysis incorporated into any revisions of the GFA strategy and plans for the pilot countries and regions. In terms of the Eli Wiesel Act, we'd like to see that reports include attention specifically to women and girls at risk to atrocities, and that the administration publicly disclose their watch list and plans or countries in which they have plans to address. And so, as I mentioned, it's been 100, I guess, maybe about 130 days at this point. Lots to do. ICRW gave the administration overall A- when they did their scorecard at the end of April. This was before the announcement of the Afghanistan withdrawal, so I wonder how that would change things. I would suggest it would lower the grade quite a bit, but there was a lot to untangle within the first 100 days, and of course, exacerbated and somewhat deprioritized due to the COVID response. However, I think overall, it's a fairly solid start, but still have a lot of work to do. So happy to answer any questions. Thank you. I see Karen's hand up. Go ahead.
Well, it's not really well, it is, I guess it is a question, but thank you so much, Megan, for such a comprehensive, I mean, your head looks the same size as everyone else's, but it must be crowded with a lot of facts up there. And I wonder if you have drafted a letter similar to our Cedaw letter, where we're wanting to get organizations and individuals to support the list of things that are still to be done in the context of a preamble that says, thank you so much for what you've done in the first 130 days. But if you were to have such a list, this would be a good organization to start with to try to get others to join you in not only signing a statement, but getting the word out to the individual members to bring it to Congress and the White House. But as you say, all in the context of what an awesome job they've done so far. But there's still things to be done.
Yeah, I don't think there's been a sort of fulsome letter yet, but there have been sort of letters on, repro rights or, GBV and kind of different sort of issues within the broader gender community. But yeah, I agree that would be something we should definitely do. I know ICRW has been really leading the way on feminist foreign policy more broadly. They host the coalition to advance feminist foreign policy, of which CWI is a member, at least through me. And they've been really doing an amazing job. They have also, there's about 8 or 9 different global gender coalitions in the DC community. So
Yeah.
You have the CSWG, the Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. You have Girls Not Brides. You have the Big Ideas Coalition, the Roundtable on Sexual and Gender Rights or Reproductive Health. So all these different groups, we work together to sort of represent the various factions. And so we've been putting together a sort of consultation with thematic workshops and really trying to drill down with the Gender Policy Council and GWI and some other State Department offices to articulate, sort of what we're seeing.
Well, I was thinking not only of the massive global agenda, but what we'd like to see the White House Gender Office be doing on domestic issues. Any case, CWI is a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. I will say the Gender Policy Council has been much more focused on domestic issues. And again, there's a lot to entangle on both. So no fault here, but so that's something we're actually trying to get them to pivot a little bit more to foreign policy, but they are, they're busy. I do know that.
I'll just say this is a comprehensive reporting, Megan. Thank you so very much. I know there was a request that whether you have any of it written that you'd be willing to share. But if it were possible, that would be wonderful. It was actually Lisa that had asked that.
Oh, sure. Happy to do that. Yeah. And let me share the ICRW scorecard, which is really helpful. Again, it's a little out of date at this point just because things move so fast. But yeah, happy to share my notes as well in email. All right, so Connie, I'll throw it back to you.
I wanted to say something. I don't know how many of you read the Post editorial page, but today they came out with the recommendations for the Virginia primary election, the Democratic primary. And they did not mention the 2 African-American women running for governor, and they did not mention Halayala, a woman of African and Arabic descent running for. I'm so disgusted with the Post. I'm about ready to cancel my subscription. That was just, I could almost write a letter to the editor on it.
But you should.
Angry.
To the editor and then cancel.
Not only that, this is the second time they have done this.
Yeah.
They did it with the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors election last time around as well. So I'm with you and happy to join that effort. I was just typing in the chat on writing a letter to the Post.
Sorry, I'm muted. This is, if you guys want to do a joint effort, that's great, but we have to get it out pretty quickly, I think, or else it isn't timely. So I don't have a lot of experience writing to editors, so anybody who does, I would be welcoming your help. I'm just so furious at this total misogynist thing and racist too, right? I mean, to ignore the fact that there are people of other races running. I mean, of course, he talks about the guy running against Herring, but it's not the same.
Maybe, Connie, if we'll write a letter to the editor about this, they'd have to print one.
Right, that's true. There'd be a landslide if we had 3. Holly?
If you notice, and people don't, how disparate the number of men writing published letters there are from men versus women. I mean, it's just, and I used to record it and I got so upset, I stopped recording it. But my friend John says that I don't have the database of how many women write letters versus how many men write letters. So I just encourage you to write. I think everyone should. And yeah, I'm going to mute for my phone. Okay.
Yeah. Connie, I don't know how to put it. Somebody talk.
Connie, could I go ahead? Can you hear me?
She's muted.
Please do.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to thank everyone for that. And I wanted to mention that I'm here sort of representing the Women's Equity Center and Action Network that is devoted to women of color. And we've got over 7,000 members now. And if there is a letter or something, we could ask Stephanie Magency, the founder, to sign on to it on behalf of our 7,000 members, mainly in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, but beyond as well. And Lisa, I would love to connect with you because we are also working on gender and racial impact assessment indicators and don't want to be reinventing the wheel. So I'd really love to connect with you after this.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Okay, and thank you, everyone. Great presentation.
I'll put my email and phone number in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Okay, perfect. And I'll send you mine.
Hi, Connie. I'm not visible, but I've got my hand raised.
Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate being on here. I'm sorry I missed a little bit of the beginning. This, I'm glad to have this information about Cedaw because the National Women's Political Caucus of the national office having a convention, very short, but a convention in July. And I'm going to propose that California take a resolution regarding Cedaw, supporting both the Cities for Cedaw effort and the national effort. So I don't know how much a resolution will help, but it'll help. On the letters to the editor, I suggest that most newspapers have a place on their website that tells you exactly what the rules are. I would suggest everybody who can submit because they may put them in online letters, even if they don't print them. A very tiny handful of letters ever get in the printed edition. But a lot of people read the comments and read the printed letter, read the online letters. So it seems to me that in this particular case, this is pretty exemplary of the sexism we continue to see in the media around women running for office. So, and I'm out here in California. I don't know that I'm the appropriate person to comment on the post comments of Virginia candidates, but this is an ongoing problem. And if you flood them with stuff, then you might get enough online to really get some attention. And I'm glad somebody brought that up. It's been a very interesting discussion the entire time.
Other suggestions? Well, I guess we can announce that our hopeful plans for our next meeting of the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues, which is scheduled for Tuesday, June 22nd at noon, is for that meeting, we're hoping to focus on the Gender Equity Education Act, which is going to be reintroduced by its sponsors, Senator Mazie Hirono and Representative Doris Matsui. And among the speakers, we're hoping that both of them will speak to us, hopefully live, and if not by video presentations if they have conflicting schedules that day. The Gender Equity Education Act, as you all may or may not remember, is the major education act to finally establish an Office for Gender Equity in the U.S. Department of Education. No such office has ever been established. We used to have the Women's Educational Equity Act program. That has long expired. And the Gender Equity Education Act has two major components. One component is to establish an Office for Gender Equity in the Department of Education. The other component is to do a lot of things to what I'm now calling an expanded Gender Equity Education Act to develop a gender equity infrastructure, which will provide grants for gender equity Title IX coordinators for training, resource centers, and collaboration with other equity experts in education so that the Title IX coordinators at the state education agencies will work with the Title IX coordinators in the school districts, who will then start to do something that hasn't been done very clearly before. All schools, public schools that receive federal financial assistance are supposed to be implementing Title IX, but it's never been clear that all K through 12 schools should have a Title IX coordinator to help with that implementation. We're hoping the expanded Gender Equity Education Act will make that clear and provide resources for that to happen. And we're also hoping that it'll establish gender equity Title IX coordinator teams in all the schools. The post-secondary institutions are clearly required to have at least one delegated Title IX coordinator. Many have many more than that. And we need to do that, as well as the Biden administration is now requesting public comments on hopeful revisions of the Title IX regulations, which DeVos unfortunately implemented in 2020. And we're hoping that those will be changed because they had a lot of complicated, questionable procedures that they were requiring. And a lot of their procedures tended to provide more protections to the people who committed sexual assaults and sexual harassment than to helping the victims. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And if the Gender Equity Education Act passes, there will be more money and more attention for the Department of Ed to actually concentrate and focusing on gender equity in education. Any comments or questions, other suggestions? We're hoping maybe we can get some other Biden administration officials. We don't know yet. We're hoping that Catherine Lehman, who's the former director of OCR during the last part of the Obama administration, she's being nominated to be the new OCR director in the Department of Ed. And so we hope that her nomination goes smoothly and that she will be a help in this, as well as many others. Any suggestions or comments?
I have one, but it's not on that topic, Sue. I recently did a large Zoom meeting on the criminalization of Black and brown girls, the adversity, sexual abuse to school to prison pipeline. And we messed up a little bit in the beginning and not everybody could get in. And so I'm in the process now of preparing a massive, I sent out 200 of them this morning and some more. But if anybody would be interested in seeing the resource sheet for that, I can put the link with the recording link in it in the chat. Is there anybody interested? Okay. All right. Let me find it.
And a last question for our devoted participants in this meeting. The Clearinghouse on Women's Issues is having its elections also on June 22nd. And if any of you are interested in helping us by participating in the Clearinghouse Board of Directors, please let any of us know, me, Connie, or others of our officers. Yes. And we would be glad to recruit activists. Connie?
Sorry, Someone who must be let in, and I'm ignoring him. I'm sorry, what did you say, Sue? I was just putting a link in the chat.
I was going to say, if anybody wanted to join our clearinghouse on women's issues.
Oh, yeah.
We welcome.
We would love it. We would just love it. I'm the membership chair, along with a few other things. So I would love it if there's anybody you know of that you think might be interested. We could put the membership link in the chat. Let me find it. CWI. Join. Where's our?
Okay, are there any other comments or questions or anything? If not, it looks like we can give people back about 8 minutes of our scheduled CWI meeting. And thank you, and especially thank our wonderful presenters, Karen and Shayna, and of course, Megan, for all their comments and for the active audience participation as well. So thank you.